Okay, so today I have a special guest. I'm here with Pete from Havelock Metal. We know that you guys have a lot of questions about metal roofing and how to do it and just the pieces that are involved and stuff. So we thought rather than just me talk about it, let's bring in somebody who's actually an expert. So let's bring in Pete. We're gonna talk through all things metal roofing today and hopefully give you guys some tips and tricks to help with yours. So you've assembled your bunkie. Most of them are gonna look something like this mock-up that I have here in front of me. So you're gonna notice you've got your fascia pieces on the gable, you've got fascia down the sides, you've got your roof boards on the top, and now it's time to cover that up, make it waterproof. So we're gonna talk through today is kind of each piece from this point on to help you guys have a better understanding and make it just feel a little bit easier. Sound good?
That sounds great. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so you're at this point. Now, I always tell everybody, let's get some type of like roof paper, underlayment, ice and water shield, something on top of here, especially if you can't like get your metal roof on right away. Let's get something on here to kind of protect it and make it waterproof. Let's talk about what that is and what they can use for that.
Sure. So what we're looking for basically is a moisture barrier.
Yes.
So in the industry, lots of different terms. Ice and water shield is a rubberized membrane, adheres to the deck, you can't remove it. It would protect the roof indefinitely on its own, just would break down over time.
Like a blue skin or something
Yeah,
like that?
it's a bit overkill for the situation, especially because a lot of the Bunkie roofs are such a steep pitch at 912.
Yeah.
Water does not want to stay on here or snow, which is great. So we want to have something on there to protect the wood. Ideally, because what will happen is there is condensation that will occur under the steel as it heats and cools with temperature, sun, shade, etc., etc. So that condensation will seep into the wood. Over the long term, damage the wood potentially.
Right.
We're not talking 2 years, 3 years, but long term.
Right.
The bunkie will be good to go the roof 40 years, but the decking underneath now might be getting a little sloppy.
Yep.
So we'd like to have something underneath it.
Yep.
Traditionally, we do full roofs from bigger homes generally. So our rolls of moisture barrier, which we'll get into a second here, it comes with 1,000 square feet, which is obviously too much for the bunkie. So we've now trying to accommodate your clients, our clients, which are amazing. We're now breaking it down to smaller increments for them based on the size of their bunkie, which is great. So this is called Palisade, our version of it that we bring in. The underlayment, it's a moisture barrier. So it will wick water away, it will repel water, but if water stood in there for a long, long period of time, eventually it would give way.
Right.
Whereas ice and water formerly wouldn't, but this works just plenty well for where we are.
Yeah.
So basically what happens is it comes as you see it here, it's fully walkable. How you'd mount that, generally speaking, would be through a staple to hold it in place, and then you'd cover it almost immediately with your strapping, etc., etc.
Yep.
So what would happen basically is you'd have it lined up, start in the corner, on your roof. We're going to cut it in sheets that are going to be long enough to cover the run. There may be a few inches overhang, just in case they cut a little unsquare or the bunkie might be out of square, likely never. But if it did, that's why we have a little bit longer there. Yeah. So, and as you move up the line, we'd have multiple pieces. Yeah. So 1, 2 layers. You want to overlap by 3 to 4 inches. And then if you get to the top of some of the bunkies and there's still a gap here, the 5th piece would just go over the cap itself.
Right.
And because it's non-vented, meaning there's no airspace really going between the inside and the exterior, we're not worried about lapping over the top.
Yeah, for sure.
That make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you guys just, it's really not that difficult. You roll it on, staple it down in a million places so it doesn't blow away.
Yep. One thing I do want to mention, I should have, I'm sorry, is that you want to make sure when you're using this type of material, it's meant for high heat resistance. So the average tar paper or any kind of wrap you might find will do great for a short period, but then once the heat of the underneath the steel kicks into it, it'll break it down and deteriorate very quickly. So it will not last you like you think it will.
Right.
It's better than zero, but the reality is it probably isn't doing much more than zero.
Right.
In a year or two, it'll be gone or disintegrated or broken down.
Right.
So if you're going to use it, you don't have to use ours by any means, but we do sell it. But having said that, you want to ensure it's for high heat resistance.
Okay. Good to know. That's a really good important point. And when they're installing it, just so you guys can see, there's 2 sides to this. So you'll see this side it's kind of got some grip to it, which is great if you're standing on the roof trying to get some grip. And then it's got this other side, which obviously doesn't have the writing on it, things like that. You want to make sure you put it right side up, right?
Put sides up, 100%.
Yeah,
yep,
so,
absolutely. That's what tells you to walk on there.
Yeah, you got a shoe mark here, so you're good. But yeah, so you'd start with this, get your paper on, and then most times people will strap the roof as opposed to just putting the metal right on the roof boards. Now, I think you can technically do that, but for airflow and everything, it would be better to strap it, right?
Yeah, I mean, we said lots of ways to skin a cat.
Yeah.
We recommend best practices.
Yep.
And airflow under the steel is always a good plan. And when you're doing that, having the strapping, especially in a bunkie situation, like we want to insulate, which we'll get that in a second, I guess. That strapping helps to do that.
For sure.
So from that perspective, the strapping now, it can be pretty much any material you want to use.
Yep.
Although there's certain advantages to different types. So if we're going to hand this here a second, if you do me a favor and pass me the raw one, the back here too. Okay. So as it relates to strapping, there's lots of different market variety. This one here is like a rough strap, which basically is going to be 4 inches wide, total of 1 inch high, like ours is 4x1. But the reality is, being a rough cut, you'll get rounded edges like this that are rough and edgy. So not ideal. If you have this down on the roof at one point in time, looking to find that exact nice flush piece for your screw, you're not going to find it as easily.
Yeah, not when you got a roof piece over top.
Right, and when you're walking on the steel, then you have a little bit of a cave there where you actually can get a little bit of dentation in there, or some engraving in there. We want to avoid that if we can.
Yep.
So again, when you're buying strapping, like anything else, lots of variety. So ours is a 1x4x12. It's a premium strap. We have rounded edges.
Yeah.
It's kiln dried, which means basically when the strap comes, it's not going to be all warped and twisted. It's going to be in pretty good shape. And basically, the rounded edges are designed to have it so that when you do walk on it, you're less likely to puncture or bend at the steel. One thing I'll also say though is 2x4, I gas all the time.
Yep.
And you absolutely can. In fact, what I might suggest, in a lot of the models you have, that's a 9/12 pitch, is super steep. So by using a 2x4, you're giving yourself a lot more of a foothold when trying to walk up and down the roof. Whereas the 1x4 will work as well, but it won't be as nice on a big 9/12 pitch.
Yep. Plus the 2x4, or even if it's a 2x2, whatever, like everybody loves that because if they're insulating their roof, they like to use the rigid sheets, which are 1.5 inches tall, right? So then it's like, perfect.
Absolutely.
I've got my 1.5 inches right there. It just butts right up to it. Everything's flush.
Yeah.
So it's very handy.
I get that question asked a lot of me when people do order their roofs about insulation. What do you think? What do you recommend?
Yep.
And the reality is, being a roofer, we put the metal together, but as far as how you want to insulate, it's not really our bag either. However, what I will say it's crucial is that when you're putting whatever strapping you're going to use, the foam can't sit, what you were referring to, higher than the wood itself.
Yeah.
The reason being is if the foam is sitting higher, so on a 2x4, it's actually 3.5 inches tall.
Yep.
Or sorry, excuse me, 1.5 inches tall, not 2. If the foam is 1.5, you're right, it sits flush, it's nice. If it sits above that level, then you have a problem. It won't actually sit tight. So when the steel goes on, you want to make sure this is as solid as possible, and the foam isn't over top of that.
Perfect. And then, so they get their strapping, whether it's the 1x, maybe they're not insulating, they do the 1x or the 2x. And then how do they know what direction to put it? Because they're like, oh, do I put it this way? Do I put it this way? Where does it go?
Absolutely. If I can turn the model just a little bit here, if that's okay. Basically, what we want to do with any strapping choice you make is you want to picture frame the exterior first. So basically, if you're looking up here, just take this off so you can see the ridge.
Move this off.
Right, you want to have it.
You guys all know this goes first, this goes second.
So your strap will start down the corner, work your way up to the ridge, over the top. Then you put the next set of strapping right in here, the entire perimeter. Then from the perimeter, you infill on, we recommend 2-foot centers. One mistake people make all the time is they put the top strap right at the very edge. Do not do that. And the reason is that when the cap goes on eventually, you want this cap to hit the actual strap, but the cap will sit lower. So when you put that in, it's not going to catch your strap. So you want to make sure the strap is, and we'll explain more at the time of the ridge, but you want to place this where the ridge will come down and meet, if that makes sense.
Yes, that makes complete sense. Because your ridge is going like this, guys. So it doesn't get anchored in here. It gets anchored in where it touches on the sides. So if your strapping's way up here and it's over it, you're missing it.
If we can show it off.
Yeah, we can show a ridge cap actually.
Perfect. So your ridge cap looks like such. So again, if you have your strap at the top, you'd have to fasten here to actually secure the ridge cap and then catch the strap.
Right.
Which is not ideal. You want to try and get the actual fastener to go as low to the edge as you can.
Yeah.
It's going to hold a closure in place at one point in time. So what you would do basically is you'd have this cap in place before this top one goes on. I'd probably mark it with a Sharpie.
Yeah.
So just mark it with a Sharpie here. Then when you pull the cap off, just mount that strap over the middle of your mark. It gives you some leeway either direction.
Yep, that's a great tip.
That's basically how I handle that top cap. So this can go in very, very late to the very last piece of the strapping that will go on here.
Nice. So we do our perimeter, We're gonna make sure that we check our ridge cap, because obviously if yours is slightly different, you wanna still make sure it's gonna work with your ridge cap for that top piece. And then, did you say it was roughly every 2 feet?
We want 2 foot on center typically.
Okay.
Now, because you may have a 9-foot run, then you just space it evenly between there.
Okay, cool.
That make sense?
Yep, that makes sense.
One thing that get asked me a lot too is if they're doing a double layer of insulation.
Yes.
So I know David's video online, your site,
Yes.
talks about doing that, which is awesome. He did it the right way, and what the one difference is this: if you're going to strap double layer, so you're basically gonna have a lower level, then you have an upper level to strap on top to double thicken it, no problem, but you have to put the bottom layer on vertically first. And the reason is that the second layer is the one that the seal adheres to.
Right.
You want to have this running lateral. The sheets run this direction.
Okay.
So if you have them only running this way, you have to really plan where the sheet hits it to
Right.
get the strap, but you're not going to find that, I
Right.
promise. By going lateral on the upper level, then you're able to make sure that you always can find the sheet to find the strap.
Yeah, that's a good point. Always make sure you're running kind of like horizontally for
The
that
upper
final,
layer. Correct.
whatever's going right before your metal roof. And
You may not need to picture frame the very first layer if it's 2 layers.
Right.
You could probably just do the one, move
Good
over
point.
the length of your, because you're going to put another layer on top
Yeah.
of it. That one you're going to picture frame.
Good point.
To ensure that you catch the steel later on.
yeah, and ideally, we tell our clients is like, we want to make sure that as best as they can, if they have to shift it a little bit for the 2 feet rule, they want to be anchoring these into their roof beams.
Sure.
So if their roof beams are running this way, we want to make sure like
Great.
you're not just in the roof boards, you're also in those roof beams, which
Absolutely.
are bulky.
The strapping is holding the roof down.
Yeah.
So you gotta make sure it's on really good and secure,
so
right?
if it's not a perfect 2 feet, we'd rather you hit the roof beam than not hit the roof beam.
Probably also comes in handy with the roof beam idea is that when you have your strap in there and you're using a screw to go through, you're not piercing through the roof inside.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So, and that's the other thing, right? When you choose your fastener for your strapping, you want to make sure that you choose a length that's going to obviously get through this and into the roof board. But for the spots where you're not going into, you know, a huge honking roof beam, you can go with whatever length screw you want. For where you're just going into the roof board, you want to make sure that you have a screw length that's not going to poke through into your bunkie so that you're scratching your head on it.
So we cover almost everything you'd ever need to put your roof on.
Yeah.
But again, we usually do main roofs for main homes.
Yeah.
So we do sell screws to put our strapping in, but not for the bunkies. They're
Yeah.
2.5 inches tall. They'll pierce through for sure. Let's
Yeah.
just be super careful. So when it comes to strapping, we could sell strapping, no problem, but we won't sell the screws for it
Yeah.
because we can't assure you're not going to pierce through.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so we've got our underlayment, and then you get your strapping on. That's kind of giving you the foundation that we would recommend for a metal roof, and whether you're insulating or not. If they determine they didn't want to strap it, they just want to go metal right on, then obviously still your underlayment. But then we would recommend for sure making sure you have a roofing nail when you put that on. That's not going to come through everywhere, right?
Yeah, so roofing nail, you mean the actual underlayment or for the steel
for
itself?
for the steel
Yeah,
itself,
no, our
yeah.
fasteners, so we do sell a 1-inch fastener.
Yes.
Our 1-inch fastener, though, is really meant for siding, and I'll get more into that when the time comes.
Yeah.
Because what we want to try and do is we always want to try and make sure that when we put our fasteners in, we're going through the actual rib of the steel. So, if this were the actual roof, the steel's on itself, there's 2 methods of thought. One is to be fastened in the flat or to be fastened in the rib. And what's interesting is depending on where you're living, Western Canada versus Ontario, Western Canada, all the websites will tell you to fasten to the flat. Has to do with potential winds, extreme winds that they get.
Right.
And the reason is that when you fasten in the fasten the flat, the advantage is that you can drill down as hard as you want.
Right.
And you're not going to damage the steel because the deck below there is to support it.
Right.
Whereas when you screw into the actual rib, you can over penetrate and then pinch the rib down, which
Right.
isn't ideal.
Yeah.
So that's why that's not a bad plan. However, it's our contention and a lot of people's contention that with the panel, you want it to be as watertight as possible. When rain or snow hits your steel, it's not going to run down your rib. It rolls
Right.
off into the flat and then down. So this is a good spot to make sure it's protected.
Yep.
And our fasteners come with a grommet to protect the edge, but then nothing is running over it like here all the time.
Right.
Or if you're in, again, Western Canada, Eastern Canada, extreme snow, certain parts of Quebec, as snow will back up on the roof, and it's tougher on a 9/12, it's gonna come up pretty quick.
It sheds pretty quick.
Absolutely, but on some of them it can back
Yeah.
up. And if it does back up, what'll happen is that it's not water, but the snow will melt.
Yes.
And now the snow is sitting on top of the fastener the entire time.
Right.
You've got a leak point potential there that we'd prefer to have in the rib than in the flat.
Right.
Having said that, If you want the flats, no problem. We sell 1-inch screws. That
Yep.
1-inch screw will need to be the entire depth of your wood because there's only a little bit here
Yeah.
without any kind of strap.
Yeah.
With a strap, you have a little more option.
Yes, yeah.
If
Would
that
definitely
makes sense.
recommend doing the strap method.
Yep.
But
it's
just
not
wanted to cover
required.
this just
Absolutely,
in case.
yep, not required by any means, for
Okay,
sure.
so let's take this off
Sure.
for a minute, and I'll take the strapping back. So let's say they have their strapping on.
Yep.
And then we're gonna start with kind of like the first pieces. So I'm actually gonna spin this one
Sure.
more time. So we can kind of, we'll just talk about the gable end first. So there's some options that you guys have here. There's something called a flying gable starter, which we would recommend on this type of end. There's also, I think I call it in the roofing ordering guide, like an optional fascia piece. That if you can make this so that you can see some of this fascia, or you can make it so it's fully covered. And with your strapping, the one thing that you want to keep in mind is that depending on how much you build out your strapping, if it's 1 layer or 2, these are the pieces that are going to cover that gap. So from wherever that strapping ends down onto your fascia, these are the pieces that are going to cover that. So we want to make sure we have the right depth of piece, or like with the optional fascia, that it comes up high enough to cover it. So let's kind of talk through. Let's start with maybe the optional fascia piece.
Sure.
And talk through how that goes on here, and how to choose your height for it and stuff.
No problem, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to start with one quick element before that.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we do the edge work, this is the part people want to overlook. It's an expense they want to save on. I want less of the trim, I want it at the top.
Right.
The reality is the steel sheet will never leak.
Right.
It's a steel
It's a
panel.
steel sheet.
It's not going anywhere. Where your roof could leak are the edges, which are the seams. So we don't protect the seam as much as we humanly can.
Right.
So this is the gable edge, and then there's an eave edge.
Yep.
And we want to protect those edges.
Yep.
So the panel, if you didn't have a flying gable, which we'll look at the examples now.
Yeah.
Okay, so when cladding your roof, it's bottom up, always. Water rolls downhill. We want to make sure everything is getting layered on that direction.
Yep.
So the very first piece item ever would typically be your starters, but fascia is the question. So
Yes.
let's look at optional fascia.
Yes. So let's bring this in so people can see it.
So fascia for us always looks the same way,
Yep.
built for the Bunkie specifically. It is basically a 1-inch bottom, which I'll explain more in a second here, and we have a top on it. That this height here is what you're referring to, that will change
Yes.
based on how you trim your roof out.
Exactly.
And the reason is that obviously from some of the starters we have here, they come down a couple of inches onto the actual fascia piece, which is great. But then if you're raising the roof by 4 inches or 3 inches if it's two 2x4s, now that's not going to suddenly, it'll be exposed and that edge will be available.
Yes.
So at that point you either have to make this get longer, the edges, or add the fascia piece.
Right.
Which I know you quite like, we've talked
I
about.
like it.
I think it looks great
Aesthetically,
too.
it looks very
It's
sharp
good,
when
we
you
send
see it.
photos when you do the coat with me. I send a photo with it so
Yeah.
you see as I think you send it
Yeah,
to with their
I
kit.
put that photo like right in our roof
Yeah.
ordering guide, just so you can see.
Yeah.
It kind of like just beautifully covers this whole thing, makes it uniform, just classic.
And less long-term maintenance.
Yes,
'Cause
that too.
You're not worried about painting or staining it
Yeah,
down the road, right?
exactly.
The one thing I will say to that again, just to make sure we're on the same page, is that this is not mandatory. However, if you raise your roof enough, it becomes mandatory because the regular trim will not cover that lip.
Exactly.
So it looks like this.
Here, I'll take the extra one for
Thank you. So when you're putting it together, basically it sits right on the bottom edge and comes up over top. Okay, now what you see here, if you turn this sideways a little bit here, there's quite a large gap in here. I just made one for the art of this particular presentation, but that I would adjust to fit where it doesn't get it past your actual straps, and then the other piece comes over top, which can look multiple different ways. This is one, we use the fine gable in a second here. It comes down from on top and then covers the edge, making it a fully solidly cladded area.
Yep.
So there's no seam or area at all wood can be exposed. That make sense?
Yeah.
One trick to the trade in installing your fascia, it goes on first, like I said, bottom up, right? So the bottom piece would go on the eave end, same thing. And then what would happen here is when you're doing it, you want to try and have a little bit of a wrap on the corner. So all it is a base gets a cut here, and the cut you'd make in a bit of a triangle shape. It looks a bit like this. You make a mark on your steel, and at the top, you cut that triangle out. You make a little nick here, and then you have a bender, which I'm passing the tool
Oh yeah.
in.
You got all the tools.
The bender would fit and then bend the steel. By making that nick at the top and the bottom, it'll curve right over, and that creates an L shape there, which then you can just slide right into place on the corner of your eave. You don't need to go in more than a half an inch or an inch just to cover that edge. And then the flying gable would come down, we'll show in a second here, over top. Why we want to do that is we want to try not to leave exposed edge.
Right.
So if you cut to the edge and then cut to the edge, that part there, it butts.
Yeah.
And I mean, a really skilled tradesperson might be able to handle that. You really kind of want to seal it. You don't want any water getting in there.
Yeah.
So it's important to do that if you can.
And if you're not a pro roofer and you're worried about like, oh, my bend's not going to look good or whatever, just remember, you know, that one piece at least is going to be on the underside, and then your overside is going to go over it and cover it.
That's exactly the point, right? So, and it doesn't be very long. It has to be just literally just to cover the edge, and the next piece will come in, look like this. So you bring your flying gable in now.
Yeah.
This is really, now, of course, this will be lower, right? Because it's going to be some of the strapping, so it would be like this. So you would never see it. It's now underneath. Okay? The flying gable itself, saw that for a second here. So this gable end can be done one of two ways. There's a traditional gable starter, which is basically an L-shaped bracket or L-shaped trim. It would just sit over top of the edge. The eave starter is almost the exact same piece. In fact, it is. The difference basically is that Bunkie is the same because it's 90 degrees.
Yes.
So the eave starter would go on, which is what this is meant to be on the eave, and then this piece would come over top on the edge. So this gable's after the eave. That makes sense? Because the water would then roll off versus underneath it.
Right.
Okay? So this is a traditional one. But on the traditional version, you're supposed to then overhang your sheet. You have some exposed area up here. A lot easier to install and then work with, but really doesn't do a lot for you.
Right.
And when you put your sheets on, there's some cutting involved.
Right.
And unless you're really experienced at it, that cut can get a little wonky.
Yeah, it'd be nice to hide that cut edge.
Right, which is why we make the flying gable. We call it, or the F gable.
I do like flying gable.
Yes. So that basically it comes in over top. So if you turn it to the side.
Yeah, we'll get it so you guys can see this channel here.
So that's the channel itself. And basically this is how the actual sits on the unit. And what happened is the panel itself, which I'll show you in a second here, slides into the channel. So it covers your cut edge. How this gets fastened is you're using either a roofing nail or a roofing screw.
Yep.
You want to come through the tongue. Okay. So you don't need more than a few to hold it together. Just you tack it in place. And basically what you want to do is you want to drill through first, probably make it a little easier.
Yep.
And then put a regular roofing nail can work, but it's tight to get it in here.
Probably easier with a screw.
I think it is a screw. And nothing too long. 1 inch is plenty lots. It would go down in. So that what happens is if the water were to come in the side from a ring, over top of the edge, it catches the channel, goes down the channel and off, which is why this has to be on top of the trim underneath. If it's not on top, it'll just catch in that trim and then rot that corner out. So it's got to be, again, everything's working your way uphill.
Yep. Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah. So let's just recap for everyone.
Yes.
So basically, the optional fascia piece, you would kind of work with the metal supplier to order the depth of this. So based on your strapping and how much you've built out the roof. Again, it's optional, but it is nice. It can go on both the eave ends and on the gable ends. And then your actual flying gable starter and your gable starter will go over top of this.
Cover the edge. So to fasten this, as it goes in place, the strapping's up here, you're going to put a screw right through the top here or a roofing nail, and that'll hold in the strapping to hold it in place.
Yeah.
Not underneath. Although if you wanted to, you could, and some do, it's fine. But I like it where you don't ever see the fastener.
Yeah.
Fastener goes on top, and if you put it in a good position well enough, it won't move, it won't trim anywhere, and then the other pieces will cover the top edges of it. You'll never see it.
And it's got that nice little lip on the bottom so that just kind of catches right underneath of your fascia.
Yeah.
So the bottom part of your fascia is covered, the whole fascia is covered. It's just got, I like it. It's got a very classic, very classy look, especially if you put your screws into the upper part where it's covered. It looks seamless because
100%.
there's no screws.
So nice, yeah.
And it's pretty easy to work with. It's just like, it's an L.
And what we also want to mention too is when you're doing it, I probably could sell one less piece by the quantities.
Right.
But then on the one spot, you're going to have 4 or 5 tabbed together, which looks kind of crummy.
Yeah.
So we like having enough that you can make it look really clean and simple.
Yeah.
And then you're not worried. Plus, if you make a mistake, you have some extra pieces to work with, which is better to have with you than try and find it later on.
Yes, absolutely. So that's the optional fascia piece. So we'll put that for the side for now, but we'll leave that with you guys to think about. And then, so then their second piece, we want them to put on.
The very first piece would be the gable starter.
The gable starter. So let's just go back to that for a quick second. So whether you do the optional fascia or not, do this one. So there's sometimes I see a few different names for it. We tend to call it the even gable starter. Do you know any other names they would call
drip
it?
edge, drip cap.
Drip edge, thank you.
All kinds of different things.
Yeah.
The reality is basically you're just trying to create a wick edge for the edge,
Yeah.
so the water drips away versus back against it.
Yeah.
What's odd about calling it a gable starter is it goes on an eave, which doesn't seem like it makes
I know.
sense. But that's because in homes,
Yes. It's
this
typically-
piece here is vertical that matches the wall.
Yes.
But the Bunkie finishes 90 degrees,
Everything's
which is
90s.
awesome, makes your life really easy. So we just use the gable starter there
Yeah.
because it's 90 degrees. So basically it would fit in just like you see it there. Okay,
Yep.
so because the fascia is wrapped around underneath, this one here, you can sit it on the edge.
Nice.
Nice and simple. And all you would do basically here is you'd fasten right to the top, and you'd use either a roofing nail or a pancake fastener. I have some
Yep.
over there I can show you guys in a second here.
Yep.
So this is a pancake fastener. We sell them, they're in bags at $2.50, but you won't need near that many for the size of
Yeah.
your roof. So I'm happy to sell them to you. You can go to the local hardware store
Yep.
and grab them. Basically, if you do a quick little pre-drill, and then this fastens right in, it's nice and flat and flush, so
Right.
nothing's gonna stand up. If you use the screws I give you, or we have the traditional roofing nail, which is a roofing screw, which you'll see with the grommet in it. Now the problem is if you use these here, you're having it sit above the edge. And the problem there is when your sheet comes across, if your actual rib catches the top of this, it's gonna sit funny and proud. It has to sit flat. So we don't wanna use these screws for anywhere except for the actual sheet and to put the ridge cap on.
Right.
That's it.
That
Everything
makes
else needs to be
sense.
other fasteners. This is the only thing you're gonna use is for the actual sheet or the ridge cap.
That makes complete sense. So yeah, so this would go on, assuming you have your strapping underneath, this is gonna sit up a
Correct.
bit. So that's why we were saying, if you aren't doing the optional fascia, we wanna make sure that, when you're ordering this, that you make sure that this distance here is enough to cover from your strapping at least down onto the fascia.
And from a finance perspective, to add the additional 1 or 2 inches here,
You might as well just do the
fascia is
option.
the same price essentially.
Yeah.
So it's your call, but that's an
Yeah.
option you have. Some people like
Exactly.
the wood, so it is what it is, but that's how you would handle that, correct?
Awesome.
Yep.
So we put this on so just so you guys can see it. So this is our gable pieces, and this is just the eave. So this is like the
Yep.
sides on most of the bunkies.
Your piece may have just dead flat up here, but it looks just
Yeah.
like this one here. Nothing different.
Yep. So that's going to go on there,
Yep.
and then we'll move to the flying gable.
Correct.
So let's talk
So
about
if we
that.
hold that in place for a
Yeah, I
second.
can hold that in.
Okay. And then we basically then put the flying gable in your end to show that it overlaps. So in the corner here, you'll see it look like this. Now the flying gable should come past
sorry.
the actual piece a little bit. And I'll explain why in a second, but it should come past a little bit here, okay?
And typically your roofing panel will as well,
And
so it'll
that's
kind of
why.
line up with that.
It makes it look really nice and clean, right? You could stop it here and the panels stick out the bottom, but that's
That'd
gonna look
look
kind of silly.
weird, yeah.
So having it come over. Now the only negative to that is that if you look underneath, there's a bit of a gray spot. The metal is only colored on one side, not both.
Right.
But it's subtle, it's small, it's not a huge deal.
Yeah.
Some will cut it away. I think it looks weirder cutting away than leaving it there.
Right.
But the cutting away part, if you wanted to, can be done after the fact too.
Yep.
So it is your choice there, but that's exactly how it laps, right? So the bottom piece on, then these, that's exactly where it goes.
That's great.
So flying gable, one trick in the trade I want to talk about here, if you don't mind.
I'll leave this out for now.
Okay, I'm gonna try to turn the model sideways, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the flying gables, mounting them. We usually have lots of leftover. So what you want to try and do here is, some people want to stop it and they want to try and miter a cut to that actual degree to fit the front here and then have the two pieces butt together.
I may have done that.
Yeah, which is not uncommon because frankly it's the easiest way to do it for you.
Right.
But the reality is now is you've created a seam there.
Yes.
And unless you're real tight, it's going to leak at some point.
Yeah.
So what we want people to do is have the first one come above the actual peak, and the next piece coming across, it's going to get stopped. But what you can do by cutting away inside channel a little bit on the upper piece, it'll slide right up inside it.
Yeah.
Now the two pieces at that point in time will overlap at the center. So if I cut away right in here, this will come right up and it'll sit in front of this piece,
Right.
which now I have a nice lap. Now
Yes.
what's weird though is this piece now is sitting on a weird angle.
Yeah.
But now you can cut that one on the line you want.
Right.
So to the eye, it'll look like it's one seam, but in reality, it's a piece
There's-
layered behind it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That makes
And that's how you seal that edge completely and not have anything getting in that area.
Right.
Really important. And you seal the channels inside work in both directions.
Nice.
So it's a bit of a cut in here to cut away a bit of that trough so it could slide up into that area. And once you get it in front of you, see it's much easier to handle.
Yes. I think maybe my second or third roof that I did, I
Yeah.
caught onto that trick.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't terrible to have them butt
Yeah.
together, but reality is you want to have
Yeah,
as
if
much
you
metal
can.
covering as we can.
Yeah. So that's your flying gable, and then, you know what, why don't I hold it and you can just show them, we'll just turn it so you guys can see how the metal panel sits in the gable.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
So you're gonna see how this metal panel comes in and it sits in this channel here.
What I want to mention first on the panel itself, there's one with a tail on the flat end and one without a flat end. The flat end is always meant to be underneath
Right.
the neck section. So the very first one you put on, no matter which way you go, doesn't matter if you go left or right, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You're gonna use this one in the channel, which you'll see in a second here, and then the flat will sit on the roof deck.
Gotcha.
The next panel will come over top of this one.
Yep.
And so forth and so on.
Yep.
If that makes any sense. And the reason is that when these panels overlap, they're designed to create an anti-siphon, which means they don't sit flush like a Lego. When they come with you in the packaging, it looks like it'll do just that. But when you get to this one spot, it will have a little bit of a gap in between those two, and it's supposed to. That air gap helps pull water out of the area. So if snow were to back up, it helps pull it out
Right.
and not get over and in there. So it's the best lap you can find in the industry. So with the tail, it's supposed to be underneath if you can. It should be.
Nice, that's a good point.
Okay, so let's go back here for a second. And the panel slides right in.
Beautiful.
So nice cut edge.
Yeah.
So again, a lot of people doing this are, I hate to use the word rookie, but
Yeah.
not experienced roofers,
Yeah.
as you would expect. So an experienced roofer, if they put a roof on and didn't have the flying gable, they should have this measured out all the way across the roof so that the other end looks like this front end.
Right.
So you don't have a nice big high rib here, and the other end have a nice big giant flat.
Right.
It'll look kind of funny,
Ah.
right? So flying
Interesting.
gables hide that.
Yes.
Because if you get the end, you have to cut a piece off, so
Yep.
be it. That piece cuts off, it sits in there, the channel looks like the rib anyway.
Right.
Nice and simple that way. If
Yeah,
that makes
that's
any
a good
sense,
point.
right? So you kind of want to have that in the back pocket if you can.
Yep.
The panel itself, people often talk about how high does it have to sit.
Yes, I know. A client sometimes will note, like when I used to do the roof ordering guides and I'd make them, a little shorter than the roof boards. They're like, this is a mistake. Like it's not as long as my roof board, but you can cheat it at the top.
Yeah, because the problem is if you make it a little too long,
Yeah.
so you do want to have a bit of an overhang. Okay, so if I look up, I'm going to pull the panel up a little bit here.
Yeah, I think our roofing guides, we kind of budget for at least about an inch overhang.
100%. You want about an inch. And the reason is that water will come and then drip back. If it does, the end is there, which is
Right.
great. But you want to make sure you have it off the edge. If you have it right to the very end of the roof line or that trim, it can actually roll back up underneath and in the area it's not protected.
Yeah.
So you want to have it down an inch. Now, if I made it exactly the right length, and for some reason it's a little bit long, for any particular reason, you then have to cut the bottom all off or cut the top all off.
Yeah.
So by having it be an inch or two less up here, you have lots of wiggle. Because remember, the cap comes down over top, right? Comes down
Yeah.
7, 8 inches on each side. You have lots of wiggle room to maneuver that panel down and up.
Yep.
So having it be an inch or two shorter than what the actual panel shows it should be, lots of room to play with.
Yes.
Which is why we like it like that.
Yeah, and we don't really need to, they don't need to be completely butted up, this panel to this panel right at the top. That ridge cap is there for that purpose.
Yep. And the
So-
closure I give you to seal the edge so
Yes.
water can't drive up underneath it. The whole point is it so you can have that available. And I mean, you're paying a little less too. It's
Yeah.
paid by the foot, so
Yeah.
there's less metal to be used.
Yeah.
Not that it's a significant difference, but some.
Still, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so we try and give you kind of the full, we'll tell you what the full length is, but yes, you can cheat it back several inches
Yeah.
and you're still covered, especially with your ridge cap. So, okay, we talked about, so basically when you've done your flying gable starter and your eave or drip edge, then you're pretty much onto your panels.
You are.
So let's talk just a little bit more about installing a panel. We've talked now about what's the ideal distance down from the top. It'll depend a bit on your panel length, but I would say you want at least an inch overhang on the bottom.
This matters the most. Make that an inch from the bottom, and wherever this sits, it sits.
Yep, exactly.
As long as the panel's covered by the cap.
Okay, so we've kind of gone over everything with the strapping, the eave and gable ends, and now we're on to the main pièce de résistance. We're on to the metal panels themselves. So we talked about basically number one importance in terms of how you place that panel is that you get a good inch overhang so that we get a proper drip off. So let's talk a little bit about the panels and how to install them and how to work with them.
Yep. A couple of install tricks is prep work. So we recommend a lot is pre-drilling the panel.
On the ground.
Yes, before you get in the roof.
That's a good idea.
When you're on the 912 pitch and you're up there,
Yeah.
and you've got to then reach in the 3 feet to get to your panel, it's difficult sometimes to get that in there. And if you do, the fastener has to then get punched in a little bit to hold in
Right.
place and then fasten it down. But if you're able to pre-drill on the ground, and we have videos on our website to do it, but it's pretty straightforward. The first one, you don't do the first panel because the first rib itself slides into the F channel.
Yeah.
So you want that to be solid.
Right.
And then, so you'd work your way forward. And the last one is fine too, but basically speaking, what you do is you want to measure where your strapping is.
Yep.
So if the first one overhangs by an inch at the bottom, and your strap is here, you got to measure 2.5 inches. I want the center of the straps at 2.5 inches. Then you go up to wherever the next strap is, and the third one, or it could be 4. Then from there, basically, you drill, and you can do 3 sheets at one time.
Yeah.
Boom, or 4 sheets, the entire side, so they're all ready to go for you.
Make sure you're strapping straight.
Make sure your strapping is straight. That's exactly right. And
Do your
it's really
chalk
important.
lines.
Yes, it's
sure.
really, really important. One trick to the trade that most people do that is a mistake is that first panel goes in, and they want to fasten at the top. Do not do that.
Okay.
The reason is that the cap's got to go on, and then when the cap goes on, I want that cap as flush to the edge as I can.
Right.
You put the fastener
If
in
the
there,
screw's
unless the
under the
fastener's
cap.
high enough where it's under the higher part of the cap, you might get away with it.
Right.
But typically speaking, you won't. And that now is going to sit proud or have it be an uneven area. So the very top one, do not put in. That's going to go in when you actually put on. That's why we measured ahead of time. Put the strap on the actual roof where it's supposed to be.
Yep.
And then if you've measured it and you pre-drilled your spot, you know where the hole is. You're not finding out where it is.
Yeah.
But what happened there basically is that, and that one there, if you pre-drilled it, fine. If you don't, maybe better. But you're going to put on the closure, which we'll go through in a second here.
Yep.
Then the cap. And then you go through the cap, the closure, the sheet into the wood
Into the
below.
wood.
And that's how you finish that part off at the end.
That's a really good tip. A really good tip.
You don't leave the very top screw. Don't drill it,
Yeah.
just because there's no point putting a hole there.
Yeah.
Even though the hole will be covered by the cap, don't put it in there. You want to basically leave the very top piece not drilled and not put in before the cap goes on.
Yep. So you get it on. I do like the pre-drilling on the ground thing. It does make life a lot easier, especially if you know you're not a roofer. Just make sure you measure really, really well with where they are. Pre-drill, and then when you get it up there, you know where it goes, and your hole's already there for you. You're not trying to fight standing on a roof and getting that screw in. And so what's kind of the typical fastening pattern? They're going to put one into each strap as it goes up?
We want one in every rib.
Okay.
On every strap.
Perfect.
Don't chintz in this area.
Yeah.
I give you more than enough to handle it. Do not chintz in this area. This will hold the roof down.
Yep.
Right, so if you want to go less, go half. I don't recommend it. We have enough to go every rib. The first one won't have any in it because it's going to be tucked in.
Yep.
But every rib after that. And basically from here, where it gets a little tricky sometimes is if the end fascia here and the rib has to get cut off. If it's cut off, okay. What you may want to do though is have this piece folded up a little bit to create a tight socket in that flying gable. You leave it down, but if you leave it down, this is now going to want to wobble a bit.
Right.
So some will put a fastener on the edge.
Right.
Again, it's in the flat, but it's okay. There's a couple there if you need to. But I recommend taking that bender I showed you, that yellow one, and basically from here, once it's cut off, you can fold that up inch at a time, and that will tuck into it'll tuck into the end of the flying gable.
Yep. Perfect.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. That's great.
Because I wish, but it won't fit where it's exactly right. It won't do that. I wish it would, but it doesn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish all of our roofs were the exact widths of these panels for you.
And one question people ask all the time is, because Bunkie Life gives you guys the fully assembled kit where you just put it together, why can't the roof be the same way? Yeah, and the reality is, it would. And the reality is, we can't. We can't cut the panels. We sell roofs this way. The individual seller has to be able to manipulate as they need to fit the roof they have.
I think even if you had precision measurements, it's just the install that everybody's going to do is so slightly different, right? How tight is it in here?
Imperfections in the material. That's the way it goes. Like it's
it has to be an on-site thing.
You got it. It has to be fair on the spot there for sure. Absolutely.
Okay, so you guys are going to screw in, and so we talked a little bit about the why we do it in the ridge. For people in crazy high wind areas like Florida or something, should they be putting it in a different spot generally?
So I would say your code may vary.
Yeah, check that
roofing
for
is a pretty loose code as opposed to building materials.
Right.
So there's not a whole lot where it's mandatory to this, that, and the other. But in those western provinces or western states or south where the winds are far different than they are here, going in the flat isn't a terrible idea.
Yep.
They also have no snow.
Yeah,
or less
that
snow.
too.
So therefore, not worry about backing up. It's more the water running. So when you're doing that though, one thing I will caution you on is when you're putting that fastener in, you can't fasten too hard to penetrate through the steel or cave the rib in.
Right.
But what you can do is go too hard that you actually break the grommet.
The little washer around it.
And then the whole point is the washer to keep the water out of it.
Because it's like a rubber, right?
It is, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So yeah, you don't want to crush that. You want that to do its job and act as a seal.
Yep. And when in the rib for that same matter though, and this happens a lot, people drill through here and they're worried about it being not tight enough. And then when they crank it down, it'll actually push down and then bend the metal and you'll see a little kink in it or a smile.
Yeah.
You can try and back it off and it might just be fine.
Yeah.
If it's not, it's not. But you're not hurting the steel there. It's just something not ideal. You want it to just be snug. And, exactly.
You know, feather it in. Don't.
Yes. Near the end, just a couple of more taps and you'll be okay with it for sure.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the screws themselves. Okay, so we've talked about that, and then.
So quick recap.
Yeah.
So we have our fascia on very first.
Yep.
The entire perimeter fascia, if you're having it.
Yep.
Then from there we have the eave ends, which is the gable starter, that just the 90-degree bend one on both. Once they're on, you put in your flying gables.
Yep.
Once they're in place, we start doing sheets.
Yep.
Right. So the sheets we have in place, and again, when we do them, again, we get the top. We're not putting the fastener in the top.
Yes.
We're doing the bottom ones, but the very top panel, we're waiting for that one.
Yep.
Okay. And now we're getting to the finishing stage of actually mounting the actual cap and the closure. So if you just hold that just for a second, that's okay?
Yes, everybody always asks, what is this? And I'm like, when you see it, you'll get it.
Right. So these closures are foam and they're designed to specifically fit the actual profile that you buy. So the way the Bunkie Life does their kits, which I think is standard, is our standard material. We have other profiles, which we can sell instead of or in lieu of if you chose to. The price point's different, they vary, but the reality is you can use different ones. But this is designed, these closures designed exactly for this particular profile. Now there's one here you see that's we call large tab, which is larger, and one that you see called small tab, which looks like the reverse, and that's because exactly it is. So we don't typically lead with small tab because it goes in the bottom. So what happens is, if you just pull the sheet up for a second here, just see it easier. So as you pull off the strip, there's a self-adhesive piece. Let's just attack it in place momentarily. What happens is it actually sits, if you pull the rib up for a second here, it sits in the end. And what you want to do is you want to mount it where it's going to be fastened. So imagine where the strap is on top, right?
Yeah.
So it's up from the actual bottom.
That first screw is in from the bottom, basically.
Right, you go all the way across, and then that sits in place. And then when you're fastening, the key to this is you fasten through the metal, through that closure, into the strap, and then into the deck below. That will hold the strap in place. If you don't do that, the strap can blow it eventually or get pushed out. So that screw holds it in place. This is really designed to keep pests, bugs, getting up underneath your roof line. And if you're in a really sunny area, like the front of Bunkie Life, bugs aren't gonna be a problem because it's really, really hot under there.
Yeah.
However, if one's nervous about it, they can put them in. But if you're in a really shaded area, a lot of cottage country, a lot of trees, bats, bugs can get in. That foam closure, you'll need to request it.
Yeah.
We just don't leave with it because we don't want to keep filling pockets that don't need them. Yeah. But it's an option you have. They're $2 each, so they're not really expensive, so by all means. And there's one per panel. This strip actually fits exactly per panel. So underneath or on top, it's the same thing. Next one comes over top to meet it. That's how it works. So you need, if you have 12 panels, you need 12 straps.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the bottom one. The top one is similar, but it sits on top. And the reason why is it's designed to keep birds, bugs, pests out of the ridge and prevent driving rain and snow coming up under the ridge cap. So if I do the cap for a second, so let me just push down top of the cap. So the cap will eventually sit just like you see it here. So if you look, there's actually an open space in there. So we want to seal that space up so things can't get underneath it, i.e. bugs, pests, or any kind of elements. So that's what foam closure is for. But now you can see is that I didn't put a screw in here, so now it's sitting nice and flat and flush, which is really nice. A little screw on that edge, and now my cap has to sit high.
Yep.
Not ideal, unless it happened to be high enough, but I can't guarantee what it's going to be, right?
This or it's going to like sense. Kink around the screw underneath. It's not going to look as great. Yeah.
So what we want to do there basically is I would have the cap in place like you see it now. I'd put a little mark on here with my Sharpie or a chalk line, whatever you want to use, and then pull it away. And once I pull it away, I can see all the way along where my mark is. Now I put my cap in. Okay, so you just basically goes over the edge there. It tacks in place. Not too difficult. Now it's going to hold itself temporarily. I put my cap back on. If I planned it right, that should be within a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch from the edge of the actual trim. And now I can fasten right here.
And right in.
And that's, so I go through the cap, through the foam, through the, oh, sorry, right here, I apologize.
Yeah.
Through the cap, through the foam, through the rib, into the strap below.
Yeah.
And I got that lined up because I didn't put a fastener in yet, and I lined up ahead of time. And on this cap, people want to skip and do every other. I give you enough screws, you should do every rib. And the reason why, if you don't, what will happen is the cap will actually wobbles a little bit. By having it in there, it looks a little cleaner. Now, when your bunkies that are high and it's steep pitch, you're not on the cap, you don't see it really too often anyway. But the reality is, it's a nicer look when it's every rib, I should say. And basically, that's how that goes on.
Perfect.
One question about some tricks of the trade too is walking on the steel is difficult. So when the roof is fully cladded, to walk back up to do this cap, not the easiest thing.
Yes.
The end isn't so bad, extension ladder, right to the edge, and you can get there. But when you're into the middle of the cap, it's difficult to do that. So one recommendation I might make is that these caps are 10 feet long.
So
so if you have a 16-footer, like a lot of your bunkies, that length is, don't put the last cap on. In fact, leave the last 2 panels off.
Yeah.
Get everything else up to this point done, put the strap in, go in there and basically mount that on the edge, fasten it in, because now you can walk on your strapping all along here. And then once you have to, then put the other sheets in and put the rest of the cap on.
Yep, that's a good tip.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
One thing I should mention about the end, so let's do this for a second here. Lift that up. Okay, so right there. So that actually would cut off. Okay, but let's put that for a second here. Okay, so what happens basically is that this would be full, but the point is that the flying gable's on, the sheet's in, this is on, you're putting the cap on now. People ask, does the cap sit on the edge? Do I tuck it in? And the answer to your question is, we want better rain off. So having it on top, and when it's pushed down, it is a slight edge there. That can be left over top, cut and folded down to meet the edge of it. Some people will put a little cut in the edge here, slide the bottom part in, so the front part now can sit more tight and get the edge. And basically any water getting here hits the channel and comes off anyway, but it's kind of your preference point. Okay. Really, there's no right or wrong there. We just want to make sure water runs off the facility. So that's ideal if you want to chip and then put that inside so it actually sits in, and this is the edge, no problem. If it's here and it's put down correctly, even caulking in here, which I gave you a tube of, at the back point there will keep water from coming in. And it's not so bad.
That's great.
The other version, so if I go back to a traditional gable for a second here. So I'll take the flying gable off. So if you don't ask for a flying gable, our competitors might give you this, which is what we use normally. This now sits in front. Now the cap sits here. This you can obviously peel away, but the reality is there's a lot of mess in here. How do you seal that edge?
Right.
Some will take it out a bit and fold it all down. That takes real craftsmanship. We can make a cap that fits the end of it. So if you don't want to use flying gables, you can use those. But we just think the flying gable gives a nice clean look, nice clean edge.
Yeah.
But you've already spent this much money on the bunkie. You want to look as good as you can. Let's make it look as good as it can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, this is super helpful. And in Havelock, obviously they've supplied pretty much every roof here on all of our factory models. And I know you've worked with a ton of our clients. You guys service all of Ontario. So for everybody in Ontario, obviously I recommend take advantage of Pete's expertise. And you can service all of Canada. It might not be cost effective.
Shipping is pretty crazy going to BC.
But whether, and obviously in the US, if you're in the US, a little bit out of their range. But the pieces that you see here today, like you should be able to find something similar.
100%. Or they may have something of a variety different.
Yeah, they might call it something different, you know, but they should be able to supply these type of pieces for your roof. They're kind of a standard metal roofing component. So
it isn't rocket science by any means. It's really difficult to do well.
Yes.
But it really is not overly challenging to find the parts that go in. So it's bottom up and basically top up. You want to make sure that everything's rolling off down to the bottom and off the roof.
Any other things that we should think about, or tips or tricks that people should know?
A few things that come up all the time when people call me is color is a big one. And one option we talk about is a standard color versus textured.
Right.
So we offer 30 different colors at our location. They're almost always in stock all the time. Some things where it can happen, but generally speaking it is. And 4 of the colors, which is black, dark graphite, charcoal, and our brown, dark brown, come in a standard and a textured version, which looks like this.
Oh yeah.
So it's subtle. It is the same color. The difference though in the textured is it actually has a pebbled finish to it if you want to put your hands on it. It has a bit of a textured feel to it. That for us is a separate color. So people say, well, why would you do it? And the textured color is about 8 to 10% more expensive because of how the paint's made to make it. Basically, it has a flatter look to it. So people use a matte finish versus gloss. I would never tell you, do you want the gloss standard? I'll say standard or textured. And the textured basically is a bit more money. There's no advantage to it. It doesn't shed the water quicker, the snow faster. It really is just an aesthetic look, whether you like it or don't like it. Yeah, so that's one difference as far as the paint goes. People would gauge all the time or thickness. And what they're asking for is how thick the actual steel is. So all of the generic profile we make, the Majestic, we usually lead with a 29 gauge, which is, and ours is high tensile, which means it's super, super rigid. So thickness is one element, and the second is how they treat the metal. It can be very, very firm or very pliable. And what happens is we use it for the sheets because it goes through a mill, it comes out, there's very little bending involved. We use the most rigid version we can. Some of our competitors use a 28, which is technically thinner or thicker than ours, very minuscule, but it is. But because theirs is a regular tensile, it isn't actually as strong, which is strange. But anyway, that's the reality of the thickness. Now, some say, well, let's go to 26 gauge, which is the next size up. Gauge works reverse, like wire. The lower the number, the thicker the steel. And 26 gauge, will it be stronger? Yeah. Will it hold out material better? No. If a tree branch hits your roof, I don't care what gauge you have, it's going to dent it and wreck it. So you're not really doing anything short of making you feel better about having a thicker gauge on. It's more money. Feel free to spend it if you do.
More of a pain to drill through.
But typically speaking, you're not going to find a real big advantage for the extra cost in doing so. But we're happy to provide it if you want because it is a viable option for us for sure. Other than that, I don't know what else I'm asked that you aren't already covered in the questionnaire here. Some of the models, like the Rockwood specifically,
that one's a bit different.
It's a split roof. So some of the materials are different. So there's no ridge cap. What they do have basically is they have a ridge cap that kind of has 2 different versions of it. We have what's called an end wall flash, which basically looks flat and then has a straight vertical, which goes in the lower piece up against the windows. And the very top, it looks very much like our gable starter, this one here. Excuse me, sorry. But it actually has a little front face and a much bigger tall face. And it actually goes over top of the steel. So it sits in the front and then goes up over the sheets like half of a cap, which is a cap flash we call it. So very similar. Again, the premise is exactly the same. You want to always clad your roof from bottom up. So those pieces are the same, it's just the tops get a little bit different looking.
Oh, this is great. I think this is going to be super helpful for everybody. Okay, so you kind of have gotten a step-by-step on roofing as much as we can hopefully help. But the one thing I just wanted to mention is obviously like your strapping pattern, your screw pattern on your roof is going to be dictated by the type of profile that you pick. So obviously go with the manufacturer recommended screw pattern and anchoring for whatever type of roof profile it is that you have ultimately gone with. But this is a pretty standard one. A lot of roofs have this kind of profile, so I think this is just super helpful all around. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it, Pete.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
And for everybody in Ontario, you're in luck. Just give Pete a call. He's at Havelock Metal. For everybody outside of Ontario, we hope that you can still use all these tips and tricks to help you with installing your metal roof.
Havelock Metal, we're actually located in Peterborough, Ontario, 901 Major Bennett Road. It's www.havelockmetal.com. And on our website, you'll find our 1-800 number there for sure.